Jesus, now they're letting the wounded train us? What's next, a blind man teaching us how to shoot?
Woody Charette, what's so funny, rookie?
A recruit mocked her scars, then went silent when the general spoke her call sign. Private Jace Monroe thought he was hot stuff when he arrived at Fort Valor, ready to show everyone how a real soldier should look. When he saw Drill Sergeant Riley Dawson's scarred face and damaged left arm, he couldn't resist making cruel jokes about the broken-down has-been. But when General Harrison visited the base and addressed her as Phoenix, the legendary call sign of the most decorated female combat veteran in modern history, Monroe realized he'd been mocking a living legend. The Georgia sun hadn't yet begun its merciless assault on Fort Valor when the bus carrying Echo Company's newest recruits rumbled through the main gate. The acrid smell of diesel exhaust mixed with the morning dew as nervous faces pressed against windows, their civilian lives officially ending the moment they stepped onto military soil. Among those faces, one stood out for its complete lack of anxiety. Private Jace Monroe, 22 years old, 6 feet of lean muscle and unearned confidence. Monroe had been the star quarterback at his small-town high school, the guy who'd never met a challenge he couldn't charm or muscle his way through. Military service wasn't his first choice, but after a DUI had derailed his college football dreams, the Army had seemed like an easy way to rebuild his reputation. The bus doors hissed open, releasing a wave of nervous energy into the humid morning air. "Look alive, ladies!" The voice that cut through the morning air belonged to Drill Sergeant Riley Dawson, 34 years old and every inch the embodiment of military precision. She stood at parade rest beside the bus, her uniform immaculate despite the early hour, her posture radiating the kind of authority that came from years of command under fire. But it was her scars that caught Monroe's attention first. A jagged line ran from her left temple to her jaw, while her left arm hung slightly stiff at her side, obvious signs of serious injury that had healed but left permanent marks. To Monroe's untrained eye, she looked like damaged goods a has-been trying to play soldier with the real warriors. The morning air carried the distant sound of other companies drilling the rhythmic cadence of military life that would soon become their world. But Monroe was focused only on what he saw as weakness standing before him. "Jesus," he whispered to the recruit beside him, loud enough for several others to hear. "They got the walking wounded training us now. What's next? Blind guys teaching marksmanship?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the group, but they died quickly when Sergeant Dawson's steel-gray eyes fixed on Monroe with laser intensity. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Something funny, recruit?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made smart people step back. Monroe, however, had never been accused of being particularly smart. "No, Sergeant. Just wondering if we're going to learn how to get ourselves blown up, too." The silence that followed was so complete that Monroe could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Every other recruit on the bus was staring at him with a mixture of horror and disbelief, understanding instinctively that he'd just crossed a line that shouldn't exist. Sergeant Dawson smiled, but it was the kind of smile that predators wore before they struck. The obstacle course at Fort Valor had been designed to break down civilian arrogance and build military discipline, but Monroe approached it with the same cocky confidence he'd brought to every challenge in his life. The morning air was thick with humidity and the sound of drill sergeants shouting commands as recruits struggled through rope climbs and tire runs. Monroe moved with athletic grace, his natural coordination serving him well as he navigated the course. He finished third overall, barely winded, while others collapsed in exhaustion. "Not bad for a pretty boy," Sergeant Dawson said as Monroe caught his breath at the finish line, sweat glistening on his forehead. "But let's see how you handle something that requires more than just muscle." The next exercise was tactical movement under simulated fire crawling through mud, while drill sergeants fired blanks overhead and set off smoke grenades. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air as recruits belly-crawled through obstacles designed to simulate the chaos and terror of real combat. Monroe treated it like another game. He moved fast, stayed low, and reached the objective first, his uniform barely dirty, while others emerged looking like they'd been dragged through a swamp. "Outstanding, Monroe!" he called out as he stood up, brushing imaginary dust off his uniform. "Maybe next time you can make it challenging." Sergeant Dawson watched him with an expression that might have been amusement, making notes on her clipboard. "You think that was challenging, recruit? Honestly, my high school football practice was harder than this." "Interesting," Dawson replied, her pen scratching across the paper. "Tell me, Monroe, what do you think combat is really like?" Monroe shrugged, his confidence unshaken by the question. "Probably a lot like this, except with real bullets. Good thing I'm naturally gifted at this stuff." "Naturally gifted," Dawson repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "And you think these scars of mine came from what lack of natural gifts?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the training grenades. Around them, other recruits were still struggling through the course, their grunts of effort and frustrated curses providing a backdrop to the conversation. "Hey, no offense, Sergeant, but maybe you just weren't cut out for the real action. Some people are built for combat. Others are built for, well, training the people who are built for combat." The other recruits had gone completely silent, understanding that Monroe was digging himself into a hole that might not have a bottom. But Monroe was too caught up in his own superiority to notice the warning signs, the way Dawson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the way her good hand clenched slightly around her clipboard. Sergeant Dawson's response to Monroe's arrogance came in the form of individual combat training. While the other recruits worked on basic drills, Monroe found himself facing one-on-one instruction that quickly revealed the difference between athletic ability and military skill. The training mat smelled of sweat and rubber as Dawson demonstrated techniques that made Monroe's high school wrestling experience look like child's play. The sound of bodies hitting the mat echoed through the training facility. "Combat isn't a game, Monroe," Dawson said as she effortlessly countered his attempts at hand-to-hand combat. "It's not about being the fastest or the strongest. It's about being smart, disciplined, and willing to sacrifice everything for your team." Monroe found himself on his back for the 5th time in 10 minutes, his confidence beginning to crack as Dawson demonstrated techniques with surgical precision. The taste of blood from his split lip mixed with the bitter flavor of humiliation. "You're holding back because I'm a woman," he said, trying to salvage his ego as he struggled to his feet. "In real combat, I wouldn't be fighting damaged goods." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and for a moment, Monroe thought he saw something dangerous flicker in Dawson's eyes, a glimpse of the warrior beneath the instructor's facade. But when she spoke, her voice was perfectly controlled, carrying the weight of experience that Monroe couldn't yet comprehend. "Damaged goods," she repeated, rolling the words around like she was examining them. Is that what you think these scars represent? The advanced combat simulation that Sergeant Dawson arranged for Monroe was unlike anything the other recruits had experienced. The facility reeked of cordite and smoke as live ammunition fired safely overhead, and explosive charges created genuine danger designed to replicate the chaos, terror, and split-second decision-making required in actual combat. Monroe entered the exercise with his usual confidence, but within minutes, he was overwhelmed by the sensory assault. The sound of gunfire was deafening, the smoke burned his eyes and throat, and the constant explosions made it impossible to think clearly. The metallic taste of fear filled his mouth. For the first time in his life, Jace Monroe discovered what it felt like to be truly afraid. "Move, Monroe!" Dawson's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Your team is counting on you." But Monroe was frozen, crouched behind cover, while simulated enemy fire pinned him down. The athletic grace that had served him so well in controlled environments meant nothing when faced with the unpredictable violence of combat. "I can't," he shouted back, his voice cracking with panic. "I can't see anything." "Then you're dead," Dawson replied matter-of-factly, "and so is everyone depending on you." Monroe's failure in the combat simulation had shattered his self-image, but instead of humbling him, it made him angry. He spent the weekend stewing in resentment, convinced that Sergeant Dawson had set him up to fail because of his comments about her scars. The barracks smelled of floor wax and nervous sweat as recruits tried to process their first week of training. "She's got it out for me," he complained to his bunkmate Private Torres, whose dark eyes held a wisdom that seemed older than his 19 years. "Probably can't stand that someone like me makes her look bad." Torres, who'd been watching Monroe's interactions with Dawson all week, shook his head slowly. "Dude, you need to shut up and listen. Sergeant Dawson is trying to teach you something important." "What, that she's bitter about getting herself blown up?" "That you don't know anything about real combat?" Torres replied, his voice carrying a weight that Monroe didn't understand. "And until you figure that out, you're going to keep embarrassing yourself." The second week of training brought more advanced exercises, and Monroe's pattern of initial confidence followed by spectacular failure became increasingly obvious. In weapons training, his natural hand-eye coordination made him a decent shot, but he couldn't adapt when Dawson introduced stress factors like time pressure and simulated combat conditions. The shooting range echoed with the crack of rifles and the ping of bullets hitting targets, but Monroe's shots were scattered when the pressure mounted. "You're thinking like an individual," Dawson explained after Monroe had failed to coordinate with his team during a tactical exercise. "Combat isn't about personal performance, it's about unit cohesion." "Maybe if my unit wasn't full of losers," Monroe muttered loud enough for his teammates to hear. The comment earned him hostile glares from the other recruits who were beginning to understand that Monroe's arrogance was a liability that could get them all in trouble. That night, Monroe found himself unable to sleep. The barracks were quiet, except for the occasional snore and the distant sound of night training exercises. Something about Sergeant Dawson's story had gotten under his skin, and despite his best efforts to dismiss it, he couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Finally, he gave in to curiosity and used the base computer lab to research her military record. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he typed her name into the search engine. What he found made his blood run cold. Sergeant Riley Phoenix Dawson, 3 tours in Afghanistan, Silver Star for gallantry in action, Purple Heart, Bronze Star with V device for valor. The citations were classified, but the basic facts were clear. She was one of the most decorated non-commissioned officers in the modern Army. But it was the newspaper article from 5 years ago that really shook him. Local soldier saves 3 lives in heroic rescue. The story described how Sergeant Dawson had repeatedly entered a burning vehicle under enemy fire to extract wounded soldiers suffering severe burns and shrapnel wounds in the process. The 3rd soldier she'd saved, the one Monroe had dismissed as a mistake, was Private First Class Michael Torres, age 19. The same Torres who was sleeping in the bunk next to Monroe's. "Jesus," Monroe whispered, staring at the screen in the empty computer lab. She saved Torres. Monroe's newfound knowledge should have humbled him, but instead it made him defensive. When Sergeant Dawson called him out for poor performance during the next day's training, he lashed out with desperate cruelty. "Must be nice having everyone kiss your ass because you got yourself blown up," he said in front of the entire platoon, his voice echoing across the training field. Some of us prefer to win without getting scarred up in the process. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Monroe knew he'd gone too far, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Sergeant Dawson's response was quiet and controlled, but her words carried the weight of absolute authority. "Monroe, you seem to have a fundamental misunderstanding about what these scars represent. Would you like me to explain it to you?" The crisis came during a night training exercise designed to test the recruits' ability to work as a team under extreme stress. The Georgia darkness was thick and humid, broken only by the harsh glare of floodlights that created deep shadows across the mock battlefield. The air smelled of cordite and sweat as Monroe's squad was tasked with rescuing simulated casualties while under heavy simulated fire. Monroe found himself appointed as team leader, a responsibility that terrified him more than he was willing to admit. The weight of command sat on his shoulders like a lid blanket. "Remember," Sergeant Dawson briefed them before the exercise, her voice cutting through the night air, "this isn't about individual heroics. It's about bringing everyone home alive." Monroe nodded confidently, but as soon as the exercise began, his carefully constructed self-image began to crumble. The chaos of simulated combat smoke that burned his lungs, noise that made his ears ring, confusion that clouded his thinking, and the constant pressure of making split-second decisions overwhelmed his ability to function. "Monroe, we need to move," Torres shouted over the sound of blank ammunition and explosive charges that lit up the night like deadly fireworks. "The casualties are in that building," but Monroe was frozen, paralyzed by the realization that people were depending on him to make decisions that could mean the difference between success and failure. His mouth was dry as sand, his hands shaking as he gripped his rifle. I can't see the best route," he stammered, crouched behind cover while his team waited for orders that wouldn't come. "Then pick one," Private Williams yelled, her voice cutting through the artificial chaos. "We're running out of time." The simulated casualties in the building were actually other recruits playing wounded soldiers, but the exercise was designed to feel real. Every second Monroe hesitated was another second that wounded soldiers were bleeding out, while their teammates risked their lives to save them. The taste of copper filled his mouth as he bit down on his tongue, trying to force himself to act. But the weight of responsibility, the fear of making the wrong decision, and the sudden understanding of what real leadership meant had paralyzed him completely. "Monroe!" Torres grabbed his arm, his grip tight with urgency. "We have to go now." But Monroe couldn't move. The golden boy who'd never failed at anything in his life was discovering what it felt like to be completely, utterly overwhelmed. "I can't," he whispered, his voice lost in the sound of simulated gunfire. "I can't do it." The exercise ended with Monroe's team failing to rescue any of the casualties, a devastating failure that would have meant multiple deaths in real combat. As the smoke cleared and the lights came up, Monroe found himself surrounded by teammates whose trust he'd betrayed and whose lives he'd failed to protect. The after-action review was brutal. The conference room smelled of coffee and disappointment as Sergeant Dawson went through Monroe's failures, methodically pointing out each moment where his hesitation had cost precious time and endangered his team. "Leadership isn't about being the strongest or the fastest," she explained to the assembled recruits, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "It's about making hard decisions under pressure and putting your team's welfare above your own safety." Monroe sat in humiliated silence, understanding for the first time that everything he'd believed about himself was wrong. He wasn't naturally gifted at combat. He was naturally gifted at individual sports where the only person depending on him was himself. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across faces that reflected disappointment and lost respect. "Sergeant," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want to try again." "Why?" Dawson asked, her steel-gray eyes studying him with clinical precision. "What's different now?" Monroe struggled to find the words to explain what had changed. The cocky quarterback who'd arrived at Fort Valor was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the true cost of leadership. I think I understand now, about the scars, about what it really means to be a soldier." "And what does it mean?" "It means being willing to get hurt to protect other people." Monroe said the words feeling strange and new in his mouth. "It means that sometimes the right choice is the one that puts you in danger." Dawson studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "That's a start, Monroe, but understanding it intellectually and living it are two different things." The weight of her words settled over him like a challenge, and for the first time since arriving at Fort Valor, Monroe felt ready to accept it. The weekend gave Monroe time to think about everything that had happened, and for the first time in his life, he didn't like what he saw when he looked in the mirror. The barracks bathroom was empty, except for the sound of dripping faucets and his own ragged breathing as he stared at his reflection. His arrogance, his cruelty, his willingness to mock someone who'd sacrificed everything for others, it all added up to a picture of someone he didn't want to be. "Torres," he said that evening, finding his bunkmate reading in the common area. The space smelled of floor wax and the lingering aroma of instant coffee. "Can I ask you something?" Torres looked up warily from his book, his dark eyes reflecting caution earned through experience. "What?" "Sergeant Dawson, when she saved you, what was it like?" Torres set down his book, his expression growing serious as memories surfaced. "It was the worst day of my life," he said quietly. "Our convoy hit an IED and our vehicle flipped and caught fire. I was trapped bleeding and I could feel the heat getting worse. He paused, lost in the memory, his hands unconsciously clenching. I thought I was going to die. Then Sergeant Dawson appeared out of nowhere, pulling me out of the wreckage. She went back for Martinez, then back again for Johnson. By the time she got Johnson out, her uniform was on fire and she was bleeding from shrapnel wounds. Why did she keep going back? Monroe asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because that's what soldiers do, Torres replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. They don't leave people behind, even when it would be safer to run. Monroe felt something break inside his chest, the last remnants of his old self-image crumbling away like a house of cards in a hurricane. I've been such an ass, he whispered. Yeah, Torres agreed without hesitation. But maybe it's not too late to change. Monroe's approach to training changed completely after his conversation with Torres. The morning air was crisp as he approached each exercise with a new mindset. Instead of trying to show off his individual skills, he focused on learning how to work as part of a team. Instead of mocking Sergeant Dawson's teaching methods, he listened carefully to every word, understanding that her scars represented wisdom earned through sacrifice. Better Monroe, Dawson said after a tactical exercise where he'd successfully coordinated his team's movement through a complex obstacle course. You're starting to think like a soldier instead of an athlete. Thank you, Sergeant, Monroe replied, and for the first time, he meant it with every fiber of his being. The change didn't go unnoticed by his fellow recruits, who gradually began to trust him with more responsibility. Torres, in particular, seemed willing to give him a second chance, understanding that people could change if they were willing to do the hard work of examining themselves honestly. You're different, Williams observed after Monroe had volunteered to carry extra equipment for a struggling teammate during a long march. What happened? I figured out that I was wrong about everything, Monroe replied, simply, sweat dripping down his face as he adjusted the extra weight. About what makes someone strong, about what makes someone a leader, about what these scars really mean. The real test of Monroe's transformation came during another combat simulation, this one designed to be even more challenging than the exercise where he'd failed so spectacularly. The facility was filled with smoke and the sound of simulated gunfire as Monroe approached it with a completely different mindset. Instead of trying to be the hero, he focused on keeping his team together. Instead of rushing ahead to prove his courage, he made careful decisions based on what would keep everyone safe. When Torres was wounded during the exercise, Monroe didn't hesitate to expose himself to simulated enemy fire to drag his teammate to safety. The acrid smell of smoke grenades filled his nostrils as he pulled Torres behind, cover his heart pounding with adrenaline and purpose. Outstanding work, Monroe, Sergeant Dawson said after the exercise, her voice carrying a note of approval he'd never heard before. You put your team's welfare above your own safety. That's what real leadership looks like. Monroe felt a surge of pride, but it was different from the ego-driven satisfaction he'd felt before. This was the pride that came from knowing he'd done the right thing, even when it was difficult. Sergeant, he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, I owe you an apology for everything I said about your scars, about your service. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Dawson studied him for a moment, her steel-gray eyes searching his face for signs of sincerity. Apology accepted, Monroe, but the real test isn't whether you can say you're sorry. It's whether you can live up to the standards you're apologizing for failing to meet. The transformation of Monroe's character was put to the ultimate test when General Harrison, the base commander, arrived for an unscheduled inspection. The general's presence sent the entire base into high alert, with drill sergeants scrambling to ensure everything was perfect. Monroe had heard about the general, a decorated combat veteran who'd served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, but he'd never seen him in person. The man radiated authority like heat from a furnace, his chest adorned with ribbons that told the story of a distinguished career. But when General Harrison spotted Sergeant Dawson during his tour of the training facilities, something unexpected happened that would change Monroe's understanding forever. "Phoenix," the general said, using what Monroe assumed was a nickname, his voice carrying deep respect. "Good to see you're still shaping the next generation." "Thank you, sir," Dawson replied, standing at attention with military precision. "Echo Company is coming along well." "I'm sure they are," Harrison said, his voice warm with genuine admiration. "Your reputation for turning civilians into soldiers is well deserved." Monroe felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what he was hearing. Phoenix wasn't just a nickname, it was a call sign, the kind of designation reserved for the most elite combat veterans. And the general was speaking to Sergeant Dawson with the kind of respect reserved for legendary warriors. "Sir," Monroe found himself saying before he could stop himself, his voice cutting through the morning air, "Excuse me, but did you call Sergeant Dawson Phoenix?" General Harrison turned to look at Monroe, his expression stern but not unkind. "I did recruit. Sergeant Dawson earned that call sign during Operation Enduring Freedom. She's one of the most decorated non-commissioned officers in the Army." The general's words hit Monroe like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. He'd been mocking not just a drill sergeant, but a living legend whose call sign was known throughout the military community. "Phoenix," Harrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, was the call sign given to Sergeant Dawson after she repeatedly risked her life to save wounded soldiers. The name comes from her ability to rise from the ashes of impossible situations and bring her people home alive. Monroe felt his knees go weak as the full scope of his ignorance became clear. He'd been mocking someone whose courage and sacrifice had become the stuff of military legend, someone whose story would be told in military academies for generations to come. The cocky recruit who'd laughed at battle scars was gone forever, replaced by someone who finally understood what true heroism looked like. The graduation ceremony for Echo Company took place on a crisp autumn morning, with families gathered to watch their sons and daughters complete their transformation from civilians to soldiers. The air was filled with the sound of military bands and the proud voices of family members celebrating their loved ones' achievements. Monroe stood in formation with his fellow graduates, no longer the arrogant young man who'd arrived at Fort Valor 6 months earlier. The changes in him went far beyond the obvious physical transformation. His posture reflected genuine military bearing rather than athletic swagger. His eyes held the steady confidence of someone who'd learned to put others before himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Harrison addressed the assembled crowd, his voice carrying across the parade ground. "Today, we celebrate not just the completion of basic training, but the birth of a new generation of American soldiers. These men and women have learned that true strength comes not from individual achievement, but from the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than themselves. When it came time for individual recognition, Monroe was surprised to hear his name called for the Leadership Excellence Award and honor, given to the recruit who'd shown the most growth and potential for future command responsibility. As he stepped forward to receive the award, Monroe caught sight of Sergeant Dawson in the reviewing stand. She gave him a small nod of approval, and he felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with earning the respect of someone he'd come to admire more than anyone else in his life. "Private Monroe," General Harrison said as he presented the award, "your transformation during basic training has been remarkable. You've learned that leadership isn't about being the strongest or the fastest, it's about being willing to put your team's welfare above your own." "Thank you, sir," Monroe replied, his voice steady with newfound confidence. "I had an excellent teacher." After the ceremony, as families mingled with their newly graduated soldiers, Monroe sought out Sergeant Dawson one final time. "Sergeant," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude, "I wanted you to know that everything I learned here, everything I became, I owe to you. You didn't just teach me how to be a soldier, you taught me how to be a man." "You taught yourself, Monroe," she replied, her steel gray eyes softening with something that might have been pride. "I just gave you the opportunity to discover who you really were underneath all that arrogance." Monroe smiled, understanding that his real education was just beginning. "Where do I go from here?" "Forward," Dawson said simply. "Always forward. And remember those scars you once mocked. They're not signs of weakness. They're proof that someone was willing to pay the price for something that mattered." As Monroe walked away to join his family, he carried with him the most important lesson Sergeant Dawson had taught him, that true strength wasn't measured by what you could avoid, but by what you were willing to endure for others.